Hi everyone, Kathy Beltran with Sacred Dance with Trance. I'm super excited because I get to do a second interview, or we're going to call it a chat this time, because I have Warren James here. He is a trance medium from the UK. Such a big help to me. I'm telling you, I probably have him on speed dial messenger because he shares and helps me with everything. So everybody, welcome Warren James.
Hello. Good evening. Good evening or early evening over in the UK. Hello.
Yeah, I think that's like evening, early evening.
Yeah, just on 6 o'clock.
Oh my goodness. So what I wanted
It's starting to rain.
Oh,
We're in this weather.
I heard that it's like freezing where you are right now.
No, today the weather's been very strange over here lately. A lot of strange activity going on in the air, but today it's been absolutely glorious.
Oh.
And yesterday was lovely, but it's just going overcast now, and the rain's just starting to fall. And I'm in a glass roof, so you might hear a bit of that.
Yeah, I remember the background. We had the windows in the first interview. So I want to bring up the first interview. If you guys have not had a chance to watch it, Warren was one of the first interviews I did, and I'm actually going to reshare that one. He shared his unfoldment there. Guidance, experience, everything. It's a fabulous interview. So I would absolutely watch that if you haven't done so already. So this time we decided to do a little something different because, you know, all these different things that we're doing, all the different interviews, there's like different layers to it. And so right now, Warren has such amazing knowledge on pioneer mediums, their phenomena, how their work impacted cyclical. I've got tongue twisters happening right now. And but he has so much knowledge, and I've learned so much from Warren, and that's why we're doing the second interview. So Warren, let's let you take it away.
Lovely, Kathy. Thank you very much for having me back, and I feel much more relaxed with this interview because that last one was my first attempt. The reason I've chosen to do this, most importantly, so I can explain to everybody, is simple. My experiences of trance development, you know, has been I have a very rigid view of how to do it, and that doesn't involve me going on and on and on about myself, because frankly we're all individual. That's something that was said to me by a highly acclaimed medium once, who said, I asked questions about this. Does this happen when you go into trance? Does that happen when you go into trance? Do you get this feeling, that feeling, blah, blah, blah? And the answer to it, basically, he kind of wouldn't tell me what happened to him when he went into trance. He said, it's not important. It's what happens to you. So I think for me to come on and start going on and on about various things, people will find their own way to the spirit world, and whether I say it's something like this happens to me or not, the chances of it happening to other people are so slim. They might get bits of it, bits not, so it could only cause confusion. So what I thought I would do would be to grasp the opportunity to go on a journey with psychical research. One thing, now I'll stress this before we start. One thing I'm aware of is that trance mediumship falls into two camps. There are those who love philosophy, and there are those who are looking for evidence. Now, the reality is that so-called, and I use the word loosely, trance mediums, who deal in philosophy, they're 10 to a penny, or 10 to a nickel, or 10 to a dime, whatever. I've got to be international now, haven't I? I use all currency. But there's 10 of them, you know, they're on every street corner. How many of them are genuine, we'll never know. To me, philosophy can be evidential depending what's given, and I'm not knocking it. I love philosophy. Please don't get me wrong on that. I get great value from it. But I also think that, you know, if we want to be 100% sure that what we're doing is truly working with the spirit world and not an aspect of ourselves, our subconscious or a delusional self, because I don't know a trance medium out there who has not sat there and asked that question, am I inventing this?
Yes.
Is this me? The only way we can get around that is with evidence, and that's my personal opinion. But I'm not knocking philosophy, I love it. As you know, that's why Robert Goodwin and his kind I admire,
Yes.
because it's genuine good philosophy. But what I'd like to do is touch on the history. Now, many people have talked about the history of spiritualism, the history of mediumship through spiritualism, and that's very good. But what I want to do is to touch on two aspects of my research, and I've given them both a title. So we'll do the first one, and then we'll have we can chat in between it as well. But we'll have a proper chat at the end of this bit, because I think what I have to say here will interest people who are interested in the history.
Yes.
And I've called this the monarchs and their mediums.
Oh, I love that one.
Now, it's rather interesting. I've just, within the last hour and a half, come back from the cinema, where I've been to watch Victoria and Abdul, the new movie about Queen Victoria. And it's rather fitting that this weekend we should have this discussion as I went to see that film. Because in this talk, or this first part, we will be talking about Queen Victoria and Victorian England. So let me just sort of set the scene a little bit for you. Spiritualism, modern spiritualism as we know it, which is what we are all descendants of in this subject, if you like, swept around the world in the mid-1800s, and it engulfed the world. It went from being non-existent. The Fox sisters out there near New York had their communication, and within such a short space of time, the entire world was engulfed in this new fantastic philosophy that said it could prove the continuation of the human soul, us, beyond the gates of death. And it swept around, and Victorian England was no different. In fact, Victorian England became quite an epicenter to spiritualism itself, just like Hydesville in America. So many people, now when I say people, I'm talking about men of science, philosophers, aristocracy, royalty, nobility. They converted in multitude numbers to spiritualism. Such was the evidence that people were bringing through. Such was the proof. Now, I'm going to set a scene now. It's 1861, just after, in the middle of 1861, and a very rough, abrupt, and rather unprepared Scotsman comes to stay at the Royal Palace. He has no manners. He's very blunt, and people are somewhat, especially the, as we would call it, the posh, the aristocracy, the stuck-up people, are very nervous of this man. And he had a power over this man. This gentleman had a power over Queen Victoria. He was an influencer of her from nowhere, rather like Rasputin was an influence over his Tsars there. And the question we must ask is, why was this man so holding over Victoria? How did he captivate her? And to get an idea of this, we need to go back probably 20 years before, 20 years or more before that. And we're going to go back to a place in the UK, in England, to the 2nd of July, 1846. And that place is Osborne House, which is on the Isle of Wight. And for those people who don't know, the Isle of Wight is on the bottom of England. It's a little diamond-shaped island. And that is where Queen Victoria and Albert, her husband, Prince Albert, have their holiday home. And on that day, they hosted a lady by the name of Georgina Eagle. Now, Georgina Eagle was from Warrington in Cheshire, which surprisingly so am I. Rather strange there. When I researched that, my jaw dropped. And she was there for one reason and one reason only, because she had an ability that Queen Victoria and Albert were interested in, and she was there to regale them that evening with a seance.
Wow.
At the Royal Holiday Home, and such was the impression. And I must say, we can only assume, but such was the impression of Queen made upon Victoria and Albert, that they presented her with an engraved pocket watch, which you can imagine in then days would have looked far nicer than the ones we have now. Anything we have now, they would have been royal and decorated. And the inscription said, "For meritorious and extraordinary clairvoyance."
Wow.
Right. So what we're suggesting here is that not only in Victorian England are the paupers and the commoners finding spiritualism, not only are the members of the philosophy and the science and the aristocracy, but even the royal family are finding spiritualism and mediumship is unavoidable. They're fascinated by it. Now the thing about Georgina Eagle is she was from a family of magicians. So now this is where skeptics would have a field day, but you can't, I don't believe it's right to avoid the truth. The truth is she was from a family of conjurers. And as we know from today, some of those conjurers can perform some good tricks on the mind. But even so, if that ignited their interest in spiritualism, in mediumship, then it did them a service, because what came next for Victoria was probably a rather dramatic period in her life. This is where we fast forward 20 years or so. We're now at December 14th, 1861, and Queen Victoria enters a depression, one that she's unlikely to truly re-emerge from, and she retreats out of public view, because on that day the Prince Consort, Albert, her husband, who she didn't love but adored, she was obsessed with him, took his own transition to the spirit world through illness. And she came back from public life, she stepped out of public life. But the reports and in the research that I've done suggest that while she was in the background, official reports would suggest that she continued on living, making decisions as if Prince Albert was still there. Now that's the official things, and in history that's gone down as her sign of not insanity, but her desperate grief. She couldn't accept that he'd gone. But if you do closer investigation, there is a bigger reason as to why that could be the case, as I'll explain as we go along. Now, shortly after Albert died, the news that this is why she was probably like this. Shortly after he died, news came in from Birmingham. Now, Birmingham is just half an hour, 20 minutes up the road from here, where I am now in Coventry in the West Midlands. The city of Birmingham. News came in to the royal household that Prince Albert was communicating through a medium in Birmingham, and it reached back to the palace. He was communicating through a medium. Now, some of people listening to this might find this surprising, but I assure you what I'm about to say now was not unusual for the time. He was communicating through a medium by the name of Robert James Lees. Now, R.J. Lees, as he became known, was from Hinckley in Leicestershire, in the Midlands, again, just up the road from here. He was 13 years of age.
Wow, 13.
13 years of age. Now, that was not uncommon. In fact, if you look through the history books, you'll find a lot of mediums were, it was happening in their teens, which leaves a bigger question as to when it develops. For some, perhaps at the age of puberty and things like that has an assistance in the process. Who knows? We know that a lot of children report seeing things, and then later on in life, it goes away. It stopped happening for a lot of these people. Some exceptional cases, of course, but it does happen. But he was a boy medium of 13 years of age. And he also, incidentally, worked on the famous Jack the Ripper cases later on. So he was connected, and his mediumship was quite remarkable, to say the least. He was a remarkable, remarkable medium. He is what I would call one of the telephone lines to the spirit world, one of those people who could bring through such evidence and proof that you could have two-way chats. He had that ability.
Wow, amazing.
And apparently at that seance in Birmingham, the Prince Consort, Albert, speaking through Now, I don't know if he was speaking in independent voice or through trance. That I can't verify. But one way or another, through the mediumship, he said he wanted to speak to his wife. Now, it just so happened that one of the sitters present that particular evening was a professional editor, and he transcribed the entire conversation that Albert proceeded to communicate, and that is what went back to the Royal Palace.
Wow.
So, despite her interest, I mean, she's got an interest in spiritualism, we've proved that, and that interest could have been ripening for 20 years at least, or thereabouts. But she wasn't going to be fooled. She was nobody's fool. She was a clever woman. And instead of dealing with this, what she did was they researched and found where R.J. Lees was going to be doing another seance, where this 13-year-old boy was going to be doing another seance. It seems profoundly.
Yeah.
And I mean, today you'd have the governments and the police or child protection agencies on your back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, psychologists would be all over your child.
Yes.
Not back then. And she sent two of her courtiers, all the Queen's horses and all the Queen's men. They sent two of them up to Birmingham, and it was in a place called Erdington. And they were going to sit undercover. They were dressed down. They didn't give any indication that they were a member of the royal house in any form. And they were ordered to go and sit with Lees and see what would happen. Just watch, nothing else. What can I say? If they weren't believers before they walked in that room, then something must have had an effect on them. The room was put into darkness. Whether it was trance or independent voice, as I say, we don't know. But immediately a voice emanated from either air or through this 13-year-old boy. Now, if you imagine the voice of a 13-year-old boy and what an average 13-year-old boy sounds like when they're not grunting and complaining, this young man must have left them in no doubt whatsoever who was speaking. They recognized the voice, which incidentally was a German accent, because Queen Victoria was married to a German prince. Prince Albert was a German, so he had a part German accent, and he addressed them in their real names. So much so was the accuracy and the command and the way he was, that they actually stood to their feet in the dark, bowed to their monarch, their leader, their employer, their prince, the husband of their monarch. You see why I say evidence is everything.
Yes.
With such proof, you're moving beyond the realms of believing into the realms of knowing. That must have affected those two people. Now, I've never been able to find their names, but we know of the account. Albert proceeded to give them intimate details of palace life, packed with information. They could not have had any doubt. Now, if we go back, to the when this, 1861, we're talking about certainly an age without the internet, certainly an age without television, and certainly an age without radio. We're in an age where there is no real media beyond perhaps newspapers, and I would imagine most people couldn't afford a newspaper. So it's not like palace life, which in those days was heavily guarded, unlike today, was likely to be spread out, if you like. So these were the kind of things that were taking place during that particular period in time. Now, the courtiers returned to the palace, and before they could take any action to what had happened, letters were received to the palace. Now, the schoolboy, R.J. Lees, the medium, had sent these. I don't know in what manner it was done, but letters in what we would call, or the psychical research community would call, automatic writing. Automatic writing?
Yes.
Okay. So for those, just so that people who don't,
definitely.
Either the medium is entranced, or even if they're conscious, to us their hand, some form of control over the hand. They're able to pen letters. They're able to pen write, and the information that comes through at its best, and if it's done and it's genuine and it's well developed, the person can be having a conversation this way, not even thinking about that, and their hand can be automatically controlled beyond their knowledge. And this is what had happened. Letters were sent, automatic writing letters were sent directly to the palace, and when they read them, they contained further evidence of palace life that related to Albert and Victoria intimate. Most importantly, it was signed with a pet name, a nickname, a special name that they had for each other, and nobody else knew it. So, pretty impressive.
Yes, very much so.
Now, Lees came to the palace. He was probably summoned, a royal command performance at the palace for a medium, and he paid no fewer than 9 visits to the palace in total. Now, this suggests to me that Queen Victoria must have been getting something out of this, and she wouldn't have been able to go through this alone. You know, this is the royal household, the courtiers are there, that all the people who guard them are involved. They have to be. It couldn't have continued without. Not easily anyway. 9 visits to the palace, so much so that eventually Victoria asked him to join the royal household as resident medium.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
Medium.
Yes. Now, the thing about this, as I've learned from the 2 films that have been made about Queen Victoria, and the one I've just seen now, she was rather eccentric. And I think a way of putting it is she took great delight. I think upsetting her immediate people around her who guarded her and controlled her life, I get the feeling it may have become a bit of a sport for her. So this probably would have riled them up, nobody more than the Church of England, of which she is the head. Incidentally, many years later, the Church of England did an investigation into spiritualism and found it to be true, and tried to brush away the evidence that they collated themselves. They would have succeeded had it not been for Maurice Barbanel, who leaked all the information, got it out quickly. So the Church of England know things, and that's also a fact. So she invited him to become a member of the royal household as a resident medium. To the disgrace of so many, but Lees refused. He refused on one ground. His guides said no. Now, there was a final message left to Queen Victoria through the mediumship of R.J. Lees, and the final message was this: another medium has been chosen to keep our lines of communication open. When they asked who, the reply came, the boy who used to carry my gun at Balmoral.
Wow.
Now, Balmoral is today our current monarch's official holiday home in Scotland. But in them days, it was a special place also to Albert and Victoria. The boy who carried the gun at Balmoral was the rough-spoken, abrupt, angry Scottish man by the name of John Brown. And for those people who may know or may recall, probably about 15 or 16 years ago now, a very famous drama film was made starring Dame Judi Dench, the actor, one of our fine actresses who played Victoria in this film today that I just seen, and Billy Connolly, the comedian, played John Brown, and it was an Academy-winning film. It was fantastic. But at no point in that film, bar one small reference, do they make any reference to John Brown's true nature as to why he was there and why he had such influence on Victoria. So John Brown was summoned to London. I would imagine it would have been Windsor Castle, which is the official residence, and he was, what can we say? He was considered to be Victoria's companion. He was detested by most of the staff. He was everything they hated. But he had this hold. reason he had the hold was because John Brown was a natural medium. He was an absolute astonishing medium. So much so that Victoria's lines of communication with her husband were kept open. She would never make a decision without consulting, and it was written, John Brown. And they detested the fact she would confide in this peasant man of Scotland. But, of course, on closer inspection, she's not conversing with John Brown. She's conversing with Albert, her husband, in that spirit, who was still advising her from the spirit world how to conduct herself through her life. So these are the things that people don't know about. Now, she kept records of all the seances. Everything, every seance she had with John Brown and with Albert, she made meticulous notes about the entire thing. And this was a problem, a major problem to the royal household, because this could be found one day. This could cause terrible problems for their standing, their future image, and how they were seen, especially since Victoria by this time was reclused from public life. It was going to be discussed in Parliament whether the monarch was even needed. It was happening then, and it's still happening today, of course. And so much so that Sir Henry Ponsonby, very posh name, Sir Henry Ponsonby, private secretary to the Queen, destroyed all of John Brown's diaries and all of Queen Victoria's notes. And the reason we know this is because many, many decades later, George VI, who we also know now through another film, The King's Speech, the stammering king, the stuttering king who couldn't get his words out, he found a lost diary of the experiences, and he had a speech therapist, and his speech therapist, who's in the film teaching him how to get his words correct, was Lionel Loeb. And Lionel Loeb was a spiritualist and regularly communicated with his own wife through mediums and through the abilities of mediumship. But of course, many of the facts are most certainly now lost, of course. So, you know, we only have so much to work on, you know. But it's certainly a most fascinating and interesting way of, you know, looking at the royal history. Yes. Incidentally, on that note, for those who it continued on, Queen Victoria's granddaughter, who lived in Kensington Palace, many years later, she also sent her courtiers to a sit-in with Leslie Flint.
Wow.
And again, they arrived undercover. Flint would have known no reason, especially the amount of people that came to a Leslie Flint seance. They would have had absolutely no reason whatsoever to presume that they were part of the royal household. But in the darkness of Flint's seance room, a voice appeared from midair, and as I think we've explained before, the direct voice, Flint was always conscious. He'd be sitting in the corner, sucking a sweet or playing with his fingers, picking his nails, while the voices continued the conversation. And the voice of the monarch, recently last deceased, the king, came through, spoke through, and in the darkness, Leslie Flint, in his own autobiography, says it himself, I just heard rustling in the dark, noises, and I wondered what the heck was going on. He says, and what are they doing? It turned out that they jumped to their feet and they were bowing to the monarch. Such was the evidence, and this is why I talk about the evidence so much, you know, because if we've got evidence, then it's a fair bet that whatever else comes, be it evidential or be it philosophical, can be taken with a much stronger pinch of salt than, you know, than you might have before, and almost with certainty. Now, I'm going to read something to you now. I hope this is okay with you.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
You sure?
I love this story. I love this story that you're sharing.
Okay, well, it's important. I think this history can be lost.
Yes.
So, you know, these things, I mean, I don't declare that everything is perfect. You know, how can you with history? And especially when you're trying to uncover something that doesn't want to be uncovered. It's difficult, so you have to do the best you can. But I'm going to just end this part by telling you about a medium by the name of Lillian Bailey. Now, Lillian Bailey, we're now going to fast forward many decades. King George, who had the speech problem, who was depicted in the film, has passed away. And Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, is now alone with her daughter, our current Queen, Elizabeth II. He's passed away, and I shall tell you in this film, I'll read this to you. Now, Lillian Bailey gave trance sittings to many notable people throughout the 20th century. Kings, princes, they all consulted her. She had a remarkable gift, and she was a trance medium, not a physical medium. Now, Lillian Bailey was a handful of mediums who were also responsible for making spiritualism a state-recognised religion. Now, whilst I don't personally think that's done spiritualism any favours whatsoever, and I have further research reasons as to why I believe that, but still, irrelevant. That's what she did. Such was her standing within spiritualism as a medium herself. Gordon Adams, Lillian Bailey's son-in-law, confided to Roy Stenman, the assistant editor to Maurice Barbanel at Psychic News for 8 years, and incidentally is now the editor of Psychic News, that a remarkable trance sitting had taken place in 1953. Stenman was sworn to secrecy. It was not until Lillian Bailey's death in October of 1971 that he and others who knew the story were free to discuss it, and he has included his report in his book Spirit Communication. So that'll be Roy Stenman's book Spirit Communication, if anybody wants to read that. And this is the story. Lillian Bailey knew there were people who required her to perform under the strictest test conditions before they would be prepared to accept the evidence of their own eyes and their own ears. And she always did her best to satisfy those demands within reason. So when she received a request from a stranger to give a séance at a house in Kensington, she agreed. A limousine took her to a well-appointed property. Then she was taken on to another address. She was required to put on a blindfold during the journey so that there was no visual clues about the person or people she'd be meeting. Again, she agreed. She was eventually led into a room where she sensed that others were gathering, and she was asked to conduct the sitting still wearing the blindfold. This was no great hindrance, since she often worked in trance and had no memory whatsoever. Puzzled but philosophical about the lengths to which people went to test her mediumship, she eased herself into a chair and soon felt herself drifting off into trance, allowing her main spirit helper, Bill Wooten, and others in the next world to take over her body and speak through her lips. In what seemed to her like no time at all, she returned to normal consciousness and was told she could now remove the blindfold. As her eyes grew accustomed to the light, she surveyed the sitters, sitting in a circle on gilt chairs with the Queen Mother, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, Princess Margaret, Princess Alexandra, and the Duke of Kent, most of the royal household. This astonishing experience, which happened 1 year after the death of King George VI, had clearly been arranged in the hope of receiving a communication from the dead monarch, and it was almost certainly successful. However, since she was in trance, Lillian Bailey knew nothing of the conversations that took place between members of the British royal house and those within the spirit world who wished to speak to them. Unsurprisingly, none of those who participated have ever commented directly on the secret seance. However, royal biographer and Daily Telegraph court correspondent Anne Morrow included the story in her book, The Queen Mother. She had asked Gordon Adams if Lillian Bailey was unnerved when she removed the blindfold. He replied, my mother-in-law had dealings with all sorts of people, such as Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek and King of Greece. So she did not feel intimidated by royalty. The Queen Mother is reported to have continued to phone Lillian Bailey for some time after the sitting, and further private sittings did take place. And eventually, when she came to terms with her loss, and she was clearly satisfied that the dead king continued to watch over her from the spirit world, she asked the medium to come to Clarence House one last time. Removing a piece of costume jewellery, a gold brooch, from the dress that she was wearing, the Queen Mother pinned it upon Lillian Bailey's shoulder, saying, "You know we do not have many possessions, but I would like you to have this for the help you have given me and my family." Wow. It expressed her gratitude for the comfort she received. Almost immediately, she returned to public life. Since the royal family have not confirmed the story, we can't be fully sure the event ever took place. But those who knew Lillian Bailey, who was awarded an OBE for her services during the war, they were adamant she would never make up such a story. And as a side fact on that, when writing her book, Anne Morrow received assistance from the Queen Mother and also her private secretary, Sir Martin Gillian. They saw proofs of the book. They saw exactly what she was going to go in it, and nobody objected. Wow. So there must be a truth in it, otherwise that would have been immediately removed. So I thought this would first of all be a very interesting. That's the end of that section.
Oh my God, no, I love that. I love that. And I still can't get over the fact that the kid was 13 years old.
Yes.
Like, he was so young. Oh my goodness.
Gordon Higginson, as an example, I know I speak of Gordon Higginson a lot. It might make you think I'm sort of in the Gordon Higginson fan club. I'm truly not. I just admire mediumship. But he himself was a boy medium. There was 3 names in his autobiography that he refers to. They were children medium. They were at the age of 10, 11, 12, 13. It wasn't uncommon, especially those who attended the Lyceum, which was the spiritualism version of a Sunday school. Those who attended the Lyceum, many of them became mediums themselves at a young age. And because it was a religion to their family, it was considered healthy and part of their religion to help their children develop that. And whilst I agree with that, I just don't agree with it being a religion personally, because it made it too respectful. It created rules. It suggested it must conform to a way of behaving and have churches and things. Had it have gone it alone and stayed the maverick that it was, it could have been different. Unfortunately, it succumbed to the pressures of being a religion, and that's my view. But it just shows that the British monarch, the head of the Church of England, the head of the Commonwealth, to this day, they have a connection with spiritualism and with mediumship. By all accounts, I'm sure they are all survivalists and believe that you survive.
Oh,
so there you go.
Oh my God, I love that story. And you know, it is amazing that how they burned the diaries.
Yes, it's a sad loss.
You know,
sad loss, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But I mean, at least they found one, or so say one was found. But
yes.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think that the royal family is completely, you know, interested in that. Or back then, I'm sure that it was just the rage. Everybody wanted to do that. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I love that story, Warren. I'm sitting here, I can't even think of anything. I'm just so absorbed in what you're saying.
Well, I don't think it's changed to this very day. Although we can't be sure with the younger monarchs, in the same way as many younger people today are just not interested in spiritualism and mediumship because of the image of such poor quality mediumship that's developed over the years and been allowed to infest the movement. As a result, I don't blame young people for not having an interest, but of course, plenty of people do come through and take an interest. So whether the young monarchs have that interest, but if we look at Prince Charles, he's interested in homeopathy, homeopathic remedies. He talks to his plants. He believes that helps them to grow. He's that way thinking, and his true love of his life, his true idol was Her Majesty the Queen Mother. who, of course, was the subject of that last seance, trying to contact her husband, to suggest for one moment that she didn't tell Charles of this experience.
Yes.
I don't believe that is likely. So I believe it's probably still an interest that they have to this very day.
I think so too. I love it.
Yeah.
Wow. So we are going to talk about the next person. Who is the next person?
We are. I'm going to ask you if you could just hit pause and make sure you push the right button.
I will. There you go.
Hello, we're back.
We are back. Okay. So again, I loved the first story. I mean, I'm just, we were just talking a moment ago and I was like totally absorbed in listening to the history. It's just beautiful.
As I was looking into it, you can imagine every corner was a new thing.
Yes.
So what I'll do, we'll move on to this next one. Now this, when we last spoke, I was aware that we spoke, a lot of names I mentioned were British mediums.
Yes.
And, again, referring to a comment that Gordon Higginson once said, Great Britain has produced the most wonderful and amazing mediums in the whole world. There might be a truth in that, but he's categorically wrong, because this next medium was probably one of the finest mediums, if ever. So much so, she was referred to, and I've titled this, The Eighth Wonder of the World.
Eighth Wonder of the World, wow.
And in order to get this for you, I'll set a scene. For 10 years, one address throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, was the hub, and no other address in psychical research would have been more fascinated and more, they'd want to be there. That is what I'm trying to say. Scientists, journalists, clergymen, magicians, researchers, spiritualists alike. And that address was 10 Lime Street, Beacon Hill, Boston, USA.
Wow.
Now, to understand why that address was so important, we need to look at a circle during the 1920s that existed in Ireland, and it was known as the Gallagher Circle. And the medium in that circle was a lady by the name of Kathleen Gallagher. Now, for people who want to look into her, go to Google, put her name in, and you will see very clear pictures of trumpets in mid-levitation with ectoplasm coming out of her mouth, linking to the trumpet, and scientists actually holding the psychic rods that connected to the medium and the trumpet. And they were achieving, obviously, physical phenomenon, and most certainly quality, impressive communication with the spiritual world. And so much so, it was detailed in a book by an author, W.J. Crawford, that would have been in the 20s, 30s period. Meanwhile, reading this book in Boston, USA, a gentleman by the name of Leroy Goddard Crandon, a highly respected surgeon, an admired member of society, and who had connections to Harvard University, and as a surgeon wrote a book called Surgery Aftercare, which was still being used in America right up until recent years, and this was the 20s, is reading this book about this circle in Ireland, the Gallagher Circle, and he's fascinated by the phenomenon. And being a surgeon and an academic, he decides he wants to investigate it further. And in doing so, he understood that the Gallagher Circle had a table that they would use to get table tippings and wrappings and levitations. And he decided to have an exact replica of that table made to the exact specifications and weight. And he sat with his wife, Minna Crandon, and another colleague, Dr. Mark Richardson, and they would sit. And at those very first sit-ins, they began to receive communications from a spirit entity. They would get table tipping and sounds, and very quickly that communicator gave his name, and his name was Walter Stinson. Now, Walter Stinson was killed in a train locomotive accident in 1911, and he was the deceased brother of Minna, Leroy Crandon's wife, Minna Crandon. Minna Crandon Stinson, as she would have been. And that tragic accident took him to the spirit world some years earlier. And so they sat and continued to sat, and it wasn't long before they realized that it was Minna Crandon who possessed the mediumship, who possessed that vital something that caused this to happen. And they sat, Minna, Leroy, and Mark Richardson together. And incidentally, Mark Richardson recorded every sitting that was made throughout. Now, during the 1920s, the Scientific American journal set a challenge. And that challenge was basically, in a nutshell, any physical medium who can prove without doubt that the communication with this other world or the mediumship that they are producing was genuine, there was a cash prize of £2,500, which in the 1920s would have been a quite substantial sum of money. Now, the Crandons were wealthy. He was a surgeon, after all, in a time when surgeons were paid vast sums. So the money was never an issue. But eventually the mediumship developed to such a degree that he decided they submitted to the challenge. In 1924, they submitted to the challenge. And probably because he was a surgeon, probably because he was an academic, in his mind, if this could be proved and it seemed real to them, and if he can accept it, then others could probably potentially bring in the expertise to prove it. And then his name would, Leroy Goddard Crandon, would be forever connected to the proof of survival of the soul beyond death. So that it was probably what was his motive to do it, if you like. So they submitted to the challenge in 1924, and the Scientific American investigation commenced with, I'll tell you who was involved. Dr. William McDougall, a psychologist, highly regarded psychologist, Dr. Comstock, Professor Prince, Dr. Hereward Carrington, one of the most important psychical investigators of the time, in the world probably, and then one other person by the name of Harry Houdini.
Ooh, Harry Houdini.
Right. Okay. So this is where it gets interesting. Basically, this committee sat around Minna Crandon, and they were on the verge, it would seem, of accepting that she had proven survival. It was that close, and they were on the verge of awarding them the money. At which point, Harry Houdini got news of this and immediately intervened and said, "Look, don't give her the money, don't award it, wait till I get there." Up until that point, Houdini had no involvement. Now, the history books tend to suggest that Houdini was involved. He wasn't until that point. It was many sittings, many reports in the Scientific American journals. It was all coming through, and it was going. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that Houdini's career was failing, really, by this time, or at least it wasn't the picture of health that he had once been. His star wasn't quite shining the same, and Houdini was looking for the next gimmick, and that gimmick had been to expose fraudulent mediums. Now, without doubt, he will have exposed many fraudulent mediums, but he was about to come head to head with David and Goliath of mediums, because what Minna Crandon produced was incredible, and that's what we'll go through now. He sat with Minna Crandon, Houdini, the great Houdini, as he liked to be called, sat with Minna Crandon, and very soon after those first sit-ins, he went immediately into print with a book telling everybody how she did all the tricks of the trade. Well, what he did do was show how a magician would do it. He didn't show the reality. And in fact, if you read the materials and look at the books that came out, what he suggests she did and what the scientists suggest she did, what was recorded as happened and what he thinks happened are miles apart in many cases. So he was grasping at straws. And the reason for that is because before he'd even gone there, he'd made a statement, and that statement was, "I will expose her in fraud." So before he'd even gone there, she was guilty. He couldn't possibly walk out and say, "That's true, that's genuine." So he was on a, it became a witch hunt. Incidentally, a name was then changed from Minna Crandon, for the benefit of these researchers. Malcolm Bird, who was involved in the secretary involved in all this, gave her the name Marjorie the Medium. And since those days, Marjorie the Medium is known as the biggest psychic fraud or the eighth wonder of the world, depending on which side of the fence you're going to sit on. Now, in the, I'm going to make reference now. Yes, the scientists brought many experiments along. Now, again, I go back to evidence. If you're a trance medium, the evidence can come in many forms through you. But if you're a physical medium, we're looking for physical evidence. It has to be tangible. It can't be, you know, one person in the room claims they can see something over your face appearing, or you're a transfiguration medium now, but no one else can quite see it. It has to be visible to everybody, you understand? So the Scientific American scientists and researchers devised brand new experiments that they could perform to test conclusively whether the mediumship was genuine. And this is just a couple of those ones. They first of all, well, in no particular order, they developed a bell box. Now the bell box was a sealed wooden box. Inside it was a bell and two connectors. And the only way to make that bell ring was to have those connectors come into contact. But the box was sealed shut and couldn't be opened. They would say to Walter, who was by now producing all the phenomenon through his sister, Walter, ring the bell. Walter would ring the bell. Wow. They would say, in the end, they would be walking around the room. Different scientists would hold the box in their arms and they would walk around the room. Walter, ring the bell twice. The bell would ring. Walter would ring the bell twice. Wow. So as well as independent voice, which is how Walter could communicate, as well as through trance, he could do that. They would ring the bell, they would walk around. They also devised another sealed box containing a microphone, and the microphone would go through to a speaker downstairs. And the only way that the voice could get into that microphone in this sealed box, well, it was impossible for us to do that. And these scientists tried everything. I'm pretty certain even Harry Houdini must have had a look to see if he could do it, and I'm sure he couldn't have. But naturally, Walter would get inside the box and he would speak through the microphone, and downstairs, Walter's voice very clearly would speak through the speaker. So Walter became quite a magician, quite a miracle worker. He was pushing the boundaries and very clearly determined to prove that he was still alive and he was not dead and he wasn't going anywhere. The next they invented was a contraption called a Sisyphus. Now the Sisyphus was, again, it was a box structure. It had mesh sides going around it, and you might be able to find some pictures of these on Google if people have a look. And inside the mesh, so you couldn't get into it, there was a channel, an inclined channel, and there'd be a ball at the bottom of the channel. And they would say, Walter, make the ball roll up the slope. And it would go up the slope. And contrary to what all the skeptics say, oh, well, it was dragged. It wasn't dragged. It rolled upwards. Like it would roll down, it rotated as it moved. And that's a fact. That is so often overlooked by many of the researchers on both sides of the fence, if you like. Again, scientific scales. They brought a set of scales.
Mm-hmm.
They would fully load one side, so it went down. Walter, bring them up. And Walter would tip the scales, so the loaded side went upwards and the unloaded side did exactly what the laws of physics says it should not do, which was amazing. They devised a cubicle. Now, this is not very nice, this actually, what they did to her. And this is, I'll say something on this later on, but they devised a cubicle, a bit like a telephone box to look at, a little like that. And she would sit within the cubicle. They would, there was 2 holes in either side of the box. At each side of the box, Minna she would have piano wire wrapped around her wrists and attached and secured to the outside of the box. And without doubt, if you've ever felt piano wire, that's going to cut your wrists.
Oh, yeah.
Badly. Whilst the scientific researchers would hold her hands at the same time. Meanwhile, another researcher at the front of the box, there was a hole, and they would pass objects into the box, regular objects. And Walter, within the box, the glass box, would levitate the objects around the box. Wow. So they would fly around her. And he would prove that he could manifest this. So in a way, the box, I suppose, acted like a cabinet, but they could see into it rather than it being fully closed off. So these were the things that happened. Incidentally, as well, they forced her to wear a dog collar, which had a chain that went back into the chair and securely and bolted to the floor, so she couldn't move her head. This was the injustice that was starting to grow, and the mistreatment of mediums. Yeah. When people ask why don't more physical mediums cooperate with science, well, when you've had piano wire wrapped around your wrists, bolted to the floor, and you still can't please them, there comes a point when eventually you tell them where to go. Go forth and multiply, I think is what they say. So eventually, Houdini decides that he wants to test her to the limit that he's satisfied with. So Houdini devised a spirit cabinet, and it was there are photographs of Houdini sitting in this cabinet himself on Google. It was a structure that she sat within, but it only came to the neck. Basically, it was a box that came to a head hole that her head sits out of, and she's totally concealed within the box, and there's no way she can get out, and it's padlocked all around. And just in front of here, there's a board so that she can't get her head in front of the board. And then just beyond the board and just out of reach of her is a little platform with a bell. And Houdini, all he wanted her to do was all he wanted Walter to do was to ring the bell. Now, the seance didn't even get started. Walter came through Marjorie, Minna, very promptly on that night, and he insisted that the seance could not go ahead because Houdini had hidden something under the cushion inside the box which could invalidate the entire sit-in and give Houdini grounds to suggest fraudulent activity took place. Wow. Walter himself, and I believe it's well recorded that Walter used a few choice words. So the idea that the spirit world only speak in pretty language couldn't be further from the truth. He, as I understand it, he threw Houdini out of his own seance room.
Oh my God.
Or sent him on his orders anyway. Now, Houdini swore on his mother's life that he never ever did that. But years after his death, the truth came out. Now, this again is ignored by the magicians and the illusionists who try to cast her out. With all their theories, they always miss the point that Houdini's chief engineer, who helped with his illusions, was his confidant and his assistant. Jim Collins confided many years later, he said, yeah, I threw it in. I put the ruler inside the box. He said, the truth was what the boss wanted it to be. So many years later, we can validate that Jim Collins put the ruler in there. Houdini did swear on his mother's life that he didn't, and he wasn't lying. He didn't. His assistant did. All magicians require assistance, but not all physical mediums require an assistant. That's the difference.
Yeah.
You know, and a final piece of phenomenon that was produced, and probably the most important actually, was the paranormal linking of strong wooden rings. These would be wooden rings made from two different types of wood, and they would be strongly made. Two different types of wood, so that when no one could suggest that they were carved out of one tree and made to look like that. And what would happen is the wooden rings would be placed on the table, and on many occasions they would be linked together. So one such instance was told by, some years ago now, a lady by the name of Marion Nestor was the last surviving person from those days in the 20s. Nobody else was there to tell the story, and she could tell the story. And she tells the story of how they sat in Lime Street with these researchers, with these strong wooden rings on the table. And one occasion was that Walter requested for the light to be turned out. The light went out. He requested it to go back on. And when they looked at the rings, out of one of the rings, there was a little gap been made. And next to the gap, there was on the table a little pile of sawdust.
Wow.
A little pile. And he said, fine, switch off the light. They switched off the light again. He said, switch the light back on. The sawdust had gone, and there were the rings linked.
Oh my goodness.
Now, the sad part to this is that Maurice Barbanel, Hannon Swaffer, who was the circle leader of Maurice Barbanel and Silver Birch and where those guys, Hannon Swaffer was a journalist, highly acclaimed journalist and a spiritualist, and he travelled to Boston and he went to see the rings. And he said when he got there, they'd already started to develop cracks. So no longer could they be used as concrete proof anymore. But at the time, it was proof enough to every researcher in that room that that took place. And that's something that even Houdini could never explain away. He couldn't explain how you could get two different woods from two different trees to link. Now, Marion Nestor, as I said, she was one of the people who witnessed all of this. And I just want to read something to you now. This is from this book, Stuart Alexander, My Extraordinary Journey. And Stuart, like myself, has a passionate interest in the Marjorie mediumship for various reasons. And I shall come back a little more on this later on, or a little bit further down the line. But I'd just like to read to you Marion Nestor's accounts of Walter. This lady said to Stuart, when they found her, he spoke from a point in space by direct voice, in that he did not use the medium's vocal cords. He talked throughout every seance, chatting with the sitters, taking a full part in what was going on. I can still almost hear his voice to this day. He came through as a real person. We never ever thought of Walter as a purported communicator. He was simply Walter, our friend, our advisor, an integral, functional part of our circle. We couldn't see him, but he was certainly right there in the room. He almost bristled, with forceful personality. There was nothing spooky about Walter. So Marion Nestor wrote that account. She was there. Now, the problem with researchers really is this, that they suffer with a slight problem. They witness it, and they, like these researchers, they went away in absolute awe of what was taking place. But by the next morning, they had doubts set in, concerns had set in, and they requested more and more and more tests, and it was non-ending. In fact, in 1 month, Marjorie sat 29 times in a month, which is not right. And I don't think because the pressure that would put on your body as a physical medium, your mind, your well-being and your life isn't good. So they walked away and they couldn't accept it. My personal opinion on that note is that I believe that most researchers don't want to prove it, and they don't want to accept it. They want to dissect it. And if I can say one thing to any of the developing mediums, you know, my own mediumship has been developing nicely, but always with sincere people. It's mediumship is not cold, it's not calculative, it's sensitive, it relies upon harmonious, kind, loving conditions to function. Okay, you might be able to push it, but always with the advice of the spirit world, and to me that's a fact. So I've always been lucky. Unfortunately, poor Minna Crandon, Marjorie, was not so. And the way I will conclude this part of the talk is with 3 sections. These 2 letters I think are in the public domain anyway, and they involve a communication between, you've heard of Sir Oliver Lodge? Mm-hmm. Sir Oliver Lodge was one of our most eminent scientists in the early 1900s, and also a spiritualist. He accepted fully, like Arthur Conan Doyle, they were all friends, they all worked in that same way. So what I'm going to read to you now is a letter that was wrote by, let me just find it. Where are we? I've got all my little pieces of paper and the pages to try and save time.
That's like me. That is like me.
Right. So, first name, Dr. Robin J. Tillyard, with multiple letters after his name, M.A., M.C.D., F.R.S., but, you know, clever man. One-time chief entomologist to the Commonwealth of Australia, en route from New Zealand to England, but is stopping off in Boston to sit with Marjorie. Now, Oliver Lodge himself was deeply involved, and Oliver Lodge from England wired the following letter to Dr. Leroy Crandon, Minna's husband. And this is what he said. This is Oliver Lodge. Dear Dr. Crandon, I hear from Tillyard that he is returning to New Zealand via America. He is, I believe, writing about his experiences with Marjorie in nature. If this article is admitted, it will be an important step towards challenging the attention of the scientific world. He has an idea that it would diminish the opportunities for accusations if he was allowed a solitary sitting with Marjorie in a room arranged by himself, of course with your approval, and thinks that if he got results under those conditions, the skeptics would be reduced to accuse him of collusion, which, considering his position as a scientific man, would be absurd. I know that he is impressed with Marjorie, and you may have confidence that he would treat her fairly. It is not a privilege that I would recommend you to grant to too many people, although if it were feasible, I would value it myself. I trust that she keeps in good health, and that neither of you have been bothered with any of the recent controversies. Yours sincerely, Oliver Lodge. Now, of course, Robin Tillyard then made his return journey to Australia via Boston, and it was agreed. It was agreed in July 1931, I believe. Sorry, no, Dr. Kremers, Tillyard Solicit took place on the 10th of August 1928. It took place at a surgery that Minna Crandon, Marjorie, and Leroy Crandon, Goddo Crandon, her husband, Dr. Crandon, had no knowledge where it was. And Robin Tillyard controlled the entire process. Marjorie was brought into a room by a car. It collected her. It brought her to this secret location. It took her in. She was stripped, bare naked, and a nurse examined her. When I say examined her, I mean every orifice was prodded and poked by a nurse. Such was the but it had to be done in order for this to work. I can tell you that she was bound to the chair, also bound secondary using surgical tape, and a line thick black line drawn across the skin, across the tape, to make sure it stayed in line. She sat, the lights were put out, but it wasn't completely dark. Light was still coming in. And Tilliard could clearly see much of what took place. And then from out of the darkness, or out of the air, Walter spoke. And the question was, Walter, say something. And he said, well, what do you want me to say? So he spoke. He then asked, could he use the voice cutout machine? Now, this was a device that they developed, by which Minna had to keep blowing into a tube to keep some balls elevated on some water. If she stopped blowing, the balls would sink. So whilst Walter was speaking, she was blowing, and he was still talking out of thin air. By the end of it, it was categorically proved for Robin Tilliard that he had witnessed the amazing results that science could never, fully explain. Now, the reason I have such a passionate interest in this particular medium, Marjorie, and why I have such a massive interest in Walter, is because Walter, now, today, 80 years, nearly 100 years on, works through Stuart Alexander. Still linking rings on the table, but this time plastic cable tied loops. Still giving evidence, still materializing his hand, and still doing the work and continuing to do what he set out to do all those years ago. So Walter broke his silence in 1994 and began working through Stuart. So this voice from the past is a voice that I have had the pleasure of speaking to, and it was Walter who told me about my own mediumship development, and that door would one day open. So Walter, to me, is a very, very, very special person in the spirit world.
Yes.
And the way I will end this is by telling you this, reading this to you. This is Robin Tilliard after his experience, his solo sitting with Marjorie, writing back to Oliver Lodge. Now, I find it very, very, very moving. So you'll have to excuse me if I tear up.
Oh, no.
My dear Lodge, the Tilliard Solar Seance took place last night between 9 and 10 p.m. in muggy weather, not suitable for good seance work, with a thunderstorm brewing which broke shortly after our return home. It was by far the most wonderful seance I have ever attended, and as far as I am concerned now, I should not worry if I never have another sitting in my life. Dr. Crandon made no conditions and placed Marjorie unreservedly in my hands. I think the arrangements which we made were scientifically severe, and at the same time put on record the most marvellous result in the whole history of psychical research. I am sending you my full report of this seance. I will attach to the published account Dr. X, another doctor, statement as to his searching of myself and the nurse who was involved. They were all searched. And her statement about her two searchings of Marjorie. It seems to me quite impossible to find a single flaw in this wonderful result. Whether science, under its present limitations, and I would say to this day, present limitations, can ever hope to offer any explanation, philosophical or otherwise, of these extraordinary phenomena, I very much doubt myself. But my object is to record scientifically that they do occur, that they are part of the phenomenon that we call nature. The seance is for me the culminating point of all of my psychical research. And for you, my dear friend, who has never seen anything like this, I can only ask that you and your whole family will accept my statement as absolute truth. As for Marjorie and her husband, not one man in 10,000 could have handed over his wife as trustingly to a comparative stranger as Dr. Crandon did last night, and not one woman in 10,000 could have faced such a situation so bravely. As Marjorie did. The privilege granted to me by them I shall always hold to be one of the greatest events in my life, and they are now bound closely to me by spiritual bonds which can never be broken, and which I am fully persuaded will last over into that wonderful life of which death is only the entrance gate. So long, my friend, so long, your affectionate friend, Robin Tilliard. P.S. I must not omit paying tribute to Walter, the finest ghost that I know.
Oh.
So, in the light of that, Marjorie the Medium, the greatest psychical fraud of all time, in my view, is most definitely the eighth wonder of the world. And just to take us to the final stage of her life, and again, I've taken this from Stuart's book because I think he sets the scene perfectly. And incidentally, it all came to nothing in the end, really. The whole thing was fruitless. On the 1st of November 1941, at a hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, several years after the death of her husband, a woman lay in a coma, dying. She was suffering from cirrhosis of the liver as a result of alcohol abuse. At her bedside, hoping that she would regain consciousness, was Nandan Foda, one of the world's foremost psychical researchers. At around midday, his patience was finally rewarded. She opened her eyes, she stared at him. Quickly, he leaned over and whispered, "Minna, this is your final opportunity to tell the truth. Was your mediumship genuine?" The lady thought for a while, and then, with a smile upon her face, she whispered back, "Why don't you guess? In fact, you'll all be guessing for the rest of your lives."
Oh my goodness.
She slipped back into oblivion, and at 3:30 that afternoon, she died.
Wow.
So ended the life of Marjorie the Medium, Minna Crandon. And I can say that it fascinates the life out of me. I find it very moving because as a developing medium myself, it goes to prove, and especially if we do get those, most amazing results of physical mediumship, it goes to prove how some people are going to look at you. Mm-hmm. The suspicion, and they're going to hold you in contempt with. And I just hope in telling this story, I know Stuart has told this story wonderfully with slideshows. He has many slides showing that a lot of people don't have, showing the actual scientists working with her. So she's important to him, but she's important to me, as is Walter. Without Walter, my journey may not have started like it did, and may not have got where it has. So, as I sit here now, I say, Walter, if you're there,
oh my goodness,
well done.
Oh my goodness. You know what? I'm telling you, I love listening to you. You are a fabulous storyteller. The thing is this, is that you're making these mediums from the past come alive.
Yes.
The way you're telling us the story. And I know that this particular story has such an effect on you because it's like you're learning about this. You can read about this in books or online, but you have a direct connection through him coming through Stuart, right?
Yes.
And giving you guidance. But that's amazing, just absolutely amazing.
And of course, yes, absolutely. That's so completely, absolutely true. But also, a lot of this isn't available online. Mm-hmm. That's the sad reality, and that's why I picked those two. I was also going to consider Mrs. Piper, who was another American medium, but I decided that it would go on too long. And truthfully, Marjorie and Minna and Walter deserve the world to know that they did their best and that they were not fraudulent. I'm not saying fraud doesn't take place or didn't happen. There is documented fraud in all things, conscious or unconscious, but to suggest it can be wiped away, that one thing or just two things can wipe an entire, it's like suggesting that if you've got a barrel of apples, that if one's rotten, then the rest must be. Well, it's not so. So to me, it's a labour of love as well. There's a love for it. So.
Well, the tests that they put her through, all types of tests. I mean, that's like crazy. And how she did it in 1 month?
Yes. and it, to suggest, even then, to suggest that what she went through was any different, it wasn't. In England, we had Helen Duncan, who was incarcerated into prison for 9 months because, because they believed she was becoming a threat to national security during the Second World War. Because during a séance, in good red light, the curtains opened and out walked a sailor wearing full uniform with the name Barham across the hat. And what no one knew, he spoke to his mother, but what no one knew is that Barham had been sank, and they couldn't risk that information getting out. So then, she was tried at the Old Bailey, the highest law court in the entire country. And it seems a bit extreme for a woman who's, but with her, she had Alan Price, named fully Alan Price. Scientific researcher. They do a lot. There's been a drama on about him lately, or using his name as a carrier. And he was nobody special. He tied her up in a sack. He put her in a sack and left her on the floor and said, "Right, go on, materialise." And Albert, her guide, the ectoplasm came through the gap in the sack and built up in full view, and that wasn't even enough to do it. She was put in prison. She was regularly cavity searched, every cavity of the body. It's such a cruel then, and to suggest that the world we live in now won't be. On the contrary, the world we live in now is probably, in many ways, when it comes to things like that, could be more brutal as to what they could put you through. So I think these mediums of the past gave so much. I think they shouldn't be forgotten. It's as simple as that. They should not be forgotten for what they've done, and we should remember and look at what they achieved. Not all of them were producing phenomenon materializations. Some of them were trance mediums. Some of them were philosophical trance mediums. But so the point I'm saying is there's a standard that seems to have vanished. It doesn't seem to be there. Only when we look at the past do we come to that realization. And that is what spares me on. And I hope that will be what spares many other people on.
Yes.
See?
No, I love it. I mean, I love listening to these stories. You know what? Actually, I'm going to pause 1 second.
Yes, okay.
Doom. Totally back again. Just had to
We've just been talking about everybody behind their backs, haven't we, Catherine?
Oh my God. I think while you were talking in your second story, you've made history, mediums of the past come alive just by me sitting here. Because I was thinking how, we know a little bit about all these different, the pioneers. But
yes.
The way you told the story to me, I'm sitting here and I probably already said this, but I don't care. I'm just absorbed in the story. And so I think that, what I was talking to Warren about was that I think we're going to do this again, sometime later, because the way you bring a story alive and a person's experience alive is just, you've caught me completely, and I'm learning. And this is what this is all about, all different levels and layers of trance and mediumship and all physical, everything. And so yes. I love adding this. I'm so glad that you decided to talk about this, because you really are absolutely private and you really don't like to share too much about yourself. But I so appreciate it.
No, that's fine, and bear in mind that you can touch on physical, because most physical mediumship, with the exception to a few here and there, happens through. It requires the trance state, so it requires a very deep trance state, which is something that we should all hope to. Well, they're very few and far between. That's the truth. People who come back and say, when they were in trance, oh, I didn't remember nothing. Well, I can assure you, true trance mediumship, where you go to the depths of unconsciousness, is rare. So, but because it's got trance connected with physical, you can include physical as well, because it's a vital ingredient to a point, So yeah, I'll be happy to do it again.
Good. Okay, so I do have one final question for you. So they did all this testing on the mediums of the past.
Yes.
Do they do that now? Do you know? Is there, do they do
that?
Well,
I think I'll answer it this way. The answer has to be no. The reason for that is because there just isn't those mediums anymore. Simple. If they are, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure somewhere here and there these mediums are still in existence, and still developing to such standards and amazing degrees. But I'm pretty certain they're behind closed doors, in private and unknown. The amount of mediums that can produce this kind of stuff now, today, well, find me one. I can't find one, you know. There are physical mediums, you know, out there. I won't mention any names because I could list some names, but I won't, just in case I leave anybody else out. But in truth, that they're all developing, but nobody's quite got to that, to these kind of stages like these people did, you know. And whilst I know people might criticize me for saying, well, you know, you can't expect everybody to develop to that degree. You know, I appreciate that, and I'm not saying we all can, you know, because at the end of the day, there's a truth that, you know, you might want to develop trance, you might want to develop this or that, but you might just not be capable of doing it. You know, we live in a world where everybody wants what they want. They forget, well, sometimes you can't have what you want. You know, that's the truth. So we're not developing these mediums quite to that degree anymore, at all, to that degree. Why? It's the big question. It's the big question that I think everybody's got on their lips. Why? What's changed? What's wrong? You know, a million theories, but no conclusive answers. So no, mediums are not being tested to that degree now. And if they are, it's being done quite closed because we're not finding much out about it. And if I'm wrong, then I can't wait for all those people who know something that I don't to come forward and bring and show me that I'm wrong, because I can't wait to read it. Because if it is happening, I want to be the first there to read about it. So, you know, I'm jumping the queue.
Well,
yeah.
I loved it, Warren. I'm so grateful to you for coming on a second time. So remember, everybody, check out Warren's first interview, and I will reshare that one. Sorry, okay. I'm gonna reshare it again. And again, thank you so much for taking your time out and, you know, putting all this together. But actually, you know what, Warren? This just comes naturally for you, because when I reach out to you, you're just spitting stuff out left and right. This, I'm like, okay, let me go read that. Let me go check that out, and this one and that one. So
yeah, you didn't see me at 1 o'clock this morning when I was sitting there with a bottle of wine, getting more and more drunk because it was taking longer and longer to prepare what I was going to say and trying to chop out all the right bits.
You did it fantastic. Everything just flowed effortlessly.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you, Kathy. And same to yourself, since we last spoke and watching all the other videos and even seeing some of my friends and fellow people popping up and having interviews. It's a pleasure. I think you're doing a great thing. You really are doing a good thing.
Thank you.
You know, keep it real and keep it, just remember that, keep it right, because one day you're going to take your transition over and you'll be able to tell them that you did your best, you know, and that's what matters.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much, Warren.
Thank you.
Okay, so you have a fabulous evening, and I know you got your glass of beer still.
Yes.
Beer. Okay, so thank you again, and you have a wonderful night.
And you too, Kathy. Take care. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.